is a splendid exhibition of icons and other ecclesiastical treasures here at Villanova University. Most of the icons here are Russian icons. Many of them were brought by the first missionaries to Alaska, or they were brought by Russians who fled Russia at the time of the revolution. So they have been here in the United States for some years, and it's extraordinary to see so many icons brought together in a very appealing display. And by looking at them all together, one complements the other, and you learn quite a bit about the beauty and about the theology of the Orthodox Church. And what I would like to do is to look at a few in particular, and then we can explain those in some detail. This is a triptych. In the upper part of the central panel, we have an icon of the Virgin Mary, and below we have Zechariah, who was offering incense in the temple when the archangel Gabriel appeared to him and announced the birth of St. John the Forerunner. And on the two side panels and at the top, we have 5 different saints. At the top we have St. Basil, at the top left St. Gregory the Theologian, at the top right St. John Chrysostom, at the bottom left St. Hieronymus, and at the bottom right St. Theodore the Commander. There's nothing to unite these 5 saints, but very often they were the patron saints of the family that commissioned the icon, or saints that had, for whom the person who painted the icon had a particular devotion. But the reason I wanted to focus on this icon is because of the depiction of the tabernacle. We know that God commanded Moses to make a tabernacle that would be the exact copy of what had been revealed to him in heaven. And the understanding was that the worship that was offered here below was an exact correspondence of the worship that he had witnessed taking place in heaven. And this was a very, very important concept. When the controversy over icons came about in the 8th and 9th centuries, one of the great arguments against having religious depictions was the second commandment, where God had commanded Moses, "Thou shalt not make graven images." And this accusation of idolatry was brought against the veneration of icons. But it was St. John of Damascus who pointed out that God had commanded Moses not to make graven images, and at the same time he had commanded Moses make likenesses of the cherubim, which were at either end of the ark, and this formed the mercy seat where God revealed himself to Moses. And from this we understand that the injunction of the second commandment was not against pictorial representation, but it was against trying to portray the divinity, because God had not revealed himself in a form where you could say, this is our God. The great temptation at the time was idolatry, and God had not revealed himself in a specific form. But in the incarnation, the uncircumscribable became circumscribed by time and place, and the indepictable became depictable. And so the tabernacle becomes a type of the icon, and it is also an emblem of the worship that is taking place in heaven and the worship that is corresponding here below. And these are important keys to understand the theology of the icon, but also insights into the significance and the beauty of Orthodox worship. Here in the top left corner, we have an icon that is uniquely Russian. At the very top, you see the Lord of Hosts, and then below that, the three angels who appear to Abraham. These have been taken from the early church as emblems of the Holy Trinity. And then you have the heavenly hosts, and below that, you have Christ Emmanuel appearing surrounded by the angels. On the left you have the crucifixion. On the right you have one of the most beloved icons in Russia, which was called the Blachernitisa. This was the icon of the Virgin Mary with her hands raised in prayer, and Christ superimposed upon her in a medallion. But then at the bottom left you have the victory over Satan that is promised at the end of the apocalypse when Satan is cast into the bottomless pit. And on the right you have a depiction of those who are lying in the tombs, and we recall the promise of Christ that at the second coming, at the final triumph of the saints, there shall be no more death, there shall be neither pain, nor sorrow, nor sighing, when all tears shall be wiped away. So the icon is a reminder of the heavenly hosts, of the redemption that has been wrought in Christ, but also of the promised victory at the end of the ages, when Satan shall be destroyed and when death shall be no more. So it is an icon of God's benevolence to man, but also an icon of the victory of Christians that has been promised, and an icon of hope that in the midst of every trial we look forward to the victory that has been promised us in Christ and that will take place at the end of the ages. One of the most important keys to understand Orthodox icons is what is called typology. In the New Testament, St. Paul is talking about Christ, and he says that Adam was a type of Christ. Adam was the first created man who fell because of his disobedience, but then Christ, through his obedience, undid the disobedience of the first created. So then Adam becomes a foreshadowing, looking forward to the fulfillment in Christ. And there are many patterns like this in the Old Testament, where we see that the New Testament is a fulfillment of what was seen darkly in the Old Testament. And by understanding these patterns, we get keys to understand the art of many of the icons. One of the verses in the Psalms says, "Arise, O Lord, into thy rest, thou and the ark of thy holiness." And the ark of the holiness of God is seen as a type of the Virgin Mary. And so the icon that is above, the top left, depicting the prophet David, has him holding an ark. And this is not clear just looking at the icon, but anyone who has heard the Orthodox services knows immediately that this is a depiction of that verse from the Psalms that is chanted on every feast of the Virgin Mary, where it says in the Psalms, "Arise, O Lord, into thy rest, thou and the ark of thy holiness." One of the distinctive things of icons that you see here are the elaborate silver covers. Sometimes you see, especially Greek icons, where the halo, or perhaps one of the hands of the saint, will be done in silver, and this was done many times as a vow. At a difficult time in a person's life, he might have pledged that if he was granted healing, if some other blessing or benefit happened, then as a sign of his devotion and fulfillment of that promise, then he would promise an adornment to an icon. So many times these take the place of fulfilled vows. But also, especially in Russian icons, you see silver covers that completely cover the icon. This was done both to protect the icon underneath and also to adorn it. This would be completely painted underneath, but then the silver cover would have been made to correspond to the icon that is underneath, with the openings revealed to show the saint's hands and face. And what is distinguishing about this icon is that the name of the saint was executed on enamel plaques, and then there are halos extending out adorned with diamonds, and then large stones that adorn the saint's crown. The result is something of great beauty, but also it protects the icon. This is a very distinctive icon called the Virgin Mary of the Life-Giving Spring. There was a nobleman who had been cast out of Constantinople, and when he was walking in the area, he heard a voice saying, "Leon, Leon, Vasileon." His name was Leo, and afterwards he was not only reinstated, but he became the emperor. He was convinced that this had been a revelation of the Virgin Mary, and so he made a very vast church dedicated to her memory. There was a spring there, and this became known as the life-giving spring. And so that is why in this depiction we have the elaborate spring with the Virgin Mary and the Christ child above, and then the curative waters flowing out, and many people receiving healing from the waters of this spring. And so depicted around the life-giving spring are people who are taking the waters, the curative waters, and being healed of the various infirmities. This is another Greek icon. It's an icon of the Dormition of the Virgin Mary. The Dormition of the Virgin Mary becomes the type of the dormition of each one of us. The Virgin Mary fell asleep, the apostles had assembled, and Christ is depicted receiving the soul of the Virgin Mary. And this is very touching because in icons of the Nativity, you have the Virgin Mary holding Christ as the infant, and in the icons of the Dormition, you have the Christ receiving the soul of the Virgin Mary as an infant. But if you look carefully above, you see the Virgin Mary enthroned in glory, and then she is giving to one of the apostles the belt that she wore. One of the great relics in Constantinople was the belt of the Virgin Mary that was kept at the Church of the Virgin Mary of Blacherna. It was one of the great and cherished relics of the Holy City. It was taken around the Holy City at times of danger, and it protected the city at various crises and times of attack. So the smallest details become significant if you know the history and the symbolism of the icons. One of the most beloved feast days, both in the Greek Church and the Russian Church, is known as the Protection of the Virgin Mary. The revelation of the protection of the Virgin Mary is taken from the life of St. Andrew, who was a person of great piety. He was the slave of a household of a nobleman, and although he had attained to very, very great spiritual heights, he hid those by pretending to be out of his mind. And so he is known as a fool for Christ, as one of the first, although there have been many in the history of the Church since then. And once when he was with his disciple Epiphanius in the Church of the Virgin Mary of Blacherna, they beheld in a divine vision that the Virgin Mary appeared interceding for the faithful, and then she took the veil that covered her head and she stretched it out in protection over all the faithful. And then she herself was not visible, but her protecting veil remained visible, And Epiphanius and Andrew the Fool both saw this and were moved by the reminder of the Virgin Mary's protection. So this became an important feast day that is celebrated on October the 1st in the Orthodox Church. But that day is also the feast of St. Romanos the Melodist, who composed many, many beautiful hymns that are chanted to this day in the Orthodox Church. So the icon of the protection of the Virgin Mary shows her extending her veil and protection over the faithful, surrounded by the saints, over the entrance into the altar, but then depicted below is St. Romanos, whose feast day this also is, and then to the side is St. Andrew, pointing out the vision of the protecting veil of the Virgin Mary to his disciple Epiphanius. There's a beautiful hymn that is chanted both in the Greek Orthodox Church and in the Russian Orthodox Church. It is addressed to the Virgin Mary, in which she is known as the joy of all this sorrow. And it details those who are in suffering, those who are in sorrow, those who are in sickness, and each one receives consolation and help from the Virgin Mary. But in the Russian Orthodox Church, this was taken as a depiction, and so you have icons that are known as the joy of all the sorrow. This icon is distinctive in that the gesso of both the icon and the frame was decorated with a very, very fine punched pattern. And then when the gold leaf was applied, it followed the patterning that was punched into the gesso to create the effect of tooled metal. And then paint was applied to the areas to imitate enameling. So it is a superb work of this distinctively Russian technique of the tooling and painting of the gold, where you imitate very beautiful tooled metal. This icon is also known as the Virgin Mary, the joy of all the sorrow. And this is a more traditional depiction, where the Virgin Mary is depicted in the center, and then around her you see those in afflictions and sorrows and distress, with the attending angel helping each one. The iconography is the same, but it is more difficult to see because this icon has been adorned with a silver cover, and then you have gilded halos for each of those depicted. The icon has also been adorned with a very beautiful cloth banner. This is something that is done both by Greek and Russian Orthodox, but there are many places, especially in the Ukraine, that have a distinctive pattern for each area, and then by looking at the pattern on the adornment of the icon, you know exactly what part of the Ukraine this was executed in. This is also a distinctively Russian icon. This is known as the Archangel Michael of the Apocalypse. We read in the book of the Apocalypse, which is also called the book of Revelation, that at the very end, Satan will be cast into the bottomless pit. Here you see the Archangel Michael riding on a horse, and below him is Satan being cast into the bottomless pit. And it says, Babylon is fallen, the great city. I have seen recently depicted icons where they took the University of Lenin and many of the Soviet hallmarks, and they depicted these to show Babylon is fallen. So that shows that even traditional icons can lend themselves to contemporary interpretations. And one of the great distinctive things about the icon is the horse and the archangel, both painted with this brilliant red vermilion that is distinctively Russian. Alaska was originally part of the Russian Empire, and it was the Russians who sent the first Orthodox missionaries there. Knowing that the missionaries would encounter many hardships and many challenges, and would need to be people of great spiritual stature, they appealed to the monastery of Alamo, which is located in Lake Ladoga, north of the city of Novgorod. And there certain monks volunteered to undertake this very, very heroic and difficult mission to go to Alaska and there to try to evangelize the native peoples. The most eminent of all of these was named Herman, and he lived among the Alaskans. He converted them to Christianity, and then it wasn't so much his preaching as his example that inspired them in their fervent Christian piety. He lived on an island called Spruce Island, and was very much hidden from the world in his spirituality, known only to those who were near to him. But after his death, he was glorified by God with many miracles that began taking place at his tomb. And in recent years, he was glorified as a saint recognized by all of the Orthodox Church, and has been taken as a patron saint for the Americas because he was the first saint to be glorified, recognized universally by all of the Orthodox Church as one who had won his crown in what later became the Americas. This icon was painted for the glorification of the saint, and it includes a relic of the saint in the bottom right corner. In the Christian understanding, we are sanctified body and soul, and although body and soul are rent asunder at the moment of death, we look forward to the resurrection when they shall be reunited, and both body and soul glorified, renewed, we shall be in heaven. This is the foundation for the veneration of the relics of the saints who have already been glorified, who already partake of that glory that is to come. We venerate their memory, but also we venerate their bodies, and we venerate the things that they had touched in this life as having been sanctified by the saints. All of the icons here have relics in them, so they are not only the depiction of the saint, but also contain a relic of the saint, and in venerating the icon, we venerate not only the depiction, but also the relic itself. We know that in early Christian times, very often when someone had contested for the faith and been killed for his faith, he was venerated as a martyr, and the Christians would celebrate the liturgy on the tombs of the saints because this person had triumphed and had already received his crown, and then by celebrating the liturgy there, we also remember the witness of the saint and gain the blessing of the saint. In every holy table that had been consecrated, we place the relics of the saints in the continuity of this ancient tradition. But in the Orthodox Church, there are holy tables that have not been consecrated, and upon them we place what is called the Annunciation. This is a consecrated piece of cloth that has a depiction of Christ when he was taken down from the cross and anointed for burial. The Virgin Mary, the apostles, the saints are gathered around him in lamentation, but also the angels are there, glorifying the condescension of Christ, that he condescended even unto death. And above that we see the cross. So there's the historical depiction, but also the liturgical dimension of this depiction. And in all Annunciata, we have the date and the signature of the bishop who consecrated the Annunciation, and then it specifies that this is to be used as a holy table for the celebration of the Divine Liturgy. And in the four corners are the depictions of the four evangelists. What is significant about this Annunciation is that it was the first brought by Russian missionaries to Alaska, and it has the name of the Empress Catherine the Great. And we know from that it dates from that time, and it also has the signature and the name of the consecrating bishop. When Untitled is consecrated, it is anointed with the holy chrism, exactly as a holy table would be anointed with a holy chrism, and that accounts for the discoloration that you see on the cloth itself. Holy tables always have relics of the saint that are sealed in wax and made a part of the holy table. And we do the same with Untitled. If you look carefully, behind the cross you see a little pocket. The pocket has tiny relics of the saints that have been sealed into wax, anointed with chrism, and then inserted into a pocket that is sewn close, so that even though this is a cloth that is opened for the celebration of the Divine Liturgy, included in the cloth are the relics of the saints, exactly as they would be in a consecrated holy table.